Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, Book 3, Daniel Akroyd's Revenge. Poverty and death. How little can the rich man know of what the poor man feels, when want, like some dark demon foe, nearer and nearer steals. He never tramped the weary round, a stroke of work to gain, and sickened at the dreaded sound, which tells he seeks in vain. Footsore, heartsore, he never came back through the winter's wind, to a dank cellar, there no flame, no light, no food to find. He never saw his darlings lie, shivering, the flags their bed. He never heard that maddening cry, "Daddy, a bit of bread?" Manchester Song, from Mary Barton, by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 1. Happy birthday, Daniel. Thanks, Dad. Come on, sit thyself down, lad. There's tea in the pot. Sup that, and we'll be off to Hardwick Green. Auntie Rose will be looking out for you. Young Daniel looked across the table at his father and smiled. He'd just reached 14. It was a bright Sunday morning in early August 1851, and a major stepping stone in his young life. He'd be starting work the next day as an apprentice with William and Colin Mather and Company, engineers, machine makers, millwrights and iron founders, at the Salford Iron Works in Garden Lane. "Why does Auntie Rose want to see me?" "'Cause it's your birthday, you daft aper." Daniel Akroyd looked at his son, pleased with what he saw. The lad stood 5'4" tall, slim and wiry, not unlike himself. He had long dark hair and his mother's dark brown eyes, surrounded by long, almost feminine lashes, with dark, thick eyebrows above. His cheekbones were high, his nose straight. Whenever he smiled, and he was prone to smiling a lot, being a good-natured lad, 2 dimples formed beneath his cheeks. Blessed with a good sense of humour, when necessary the lad could wield it like a weapon, that sharp it cut like a razor drawing blood before the recipient barely noticed it had been brought into play. Daniel was very much his mother's son, and many of Bess Akroyd's attributes lived on in him. Despite her murder when he was only 16 months old, Bessie's values, her aims and hopes for a better future, and her determination to see them realised, had been carefully tended and nurtured in the youngster by his beloved Aunt Rose. Daniel's only serious weakness lay in a deviant need that had taken a grip on his mind a long time previously, that long ago he couldn't remember exactly when, saving he was very young when he had made his decision. Since then he'd nursed it at times, thought about it intermittently, and worked out the fine details of its execution. It wasn't something he dwelt on a lot, not any more anyway. He'd reached the point long before where he could almost see it happening in front of his eyes whenever he willed it. It was just something he knew had to happen. He hadn't discussed his decision or intended purpose with anyone, not even his Aunt Rose. He knew it would be counterproductive to do so, and he'd be misunderstood if he did. It had to remain his secret until it was completed. Then it wouldn't matter one way or the other. Nathaniel West, Esquire, the mill manager who had murdered his mother, would receive his just deserts. Justice would be done and his mother avenged. To cut a long story short, Daniel simply intended to kill the miscreant. "Constance?" "Yes, mother." The youngster looked away from the library window and turned to the woman she relied on, and whom she had called mother for as long as she could remember. The mill owner's daughter put down her embroidery. "You'll wear the glass out staring through the window like that? They'll be here soon enough." The 12-year-old frowned. "I'm sure I do not know what you are talking about." "Of course you don't, Constance dear, any more than you realise you're blushing." Irene Rose smiled at the youngster's discomfort. "Cousin Daniel will be here soon. Now why don't you make yourself busy? I'd love some tea." "You really are impossible sometimes, mother. As if I would be worried about such a common boy as Daniel Akroyd. I have more important things on my mind, I can assure you." "None the less, Constance, my love, I think you'll find if you make some tea, time will pass, and before you know it, you'll be enjoying the company of the common boy, as you call Daniel, and I'm sure in the meantime you will no doubt rediscover your manners." Constance shook her long dark locks in mock indifference, but walked towards the library door, deciding it was better to comply with Irene Rose's wishes than argue. As she opened the door, Michael O'Donnell entered. "I've just a present for young Daniel. What do you think, Rose?" "What is it, father?" Constance asked, before he had chance to approach his wife, her carefully composed indifference suddenly giving way to curiosity. Michael had a small leather-covered box in his hand. "Open it carefully, Cushler," he said softly, passing the box over. The girl lifted the hinged lid and looked at the shiny instrument in wonder. She'd never seen anything quite like it. "What is it, father?" she repeated. "It's a micrometer. It measures metal bars to the accuracy of 10,000ths of an inch." "Why on earth would anybody want such a thing?" Michael shook his head. "Constance, my love, Daniel is setting out to be an engineer. This'll be an essential part of his equipment." "How common," she responded as she left the room. Michael, somewhat taken aback, looked at Rose. "Why is Constance acting so peculiarly?" "I wouldn't worry about it, Michael. I think she has a crush on Daniel, and she doesn't want to admit it." "A crush? They've always behaved like brother and sister." Irene Rose laughed. "But they're not brother and sister, are they? Daniel's a rather handsome young man, and Constance is at an age where she's seeing him in a new light. She just doesn't want to admit it. She'll be 13 next May. She's growing into a young woman fast." The whole idea seemed completely new to the Irishman. "What does Daniel think?" "I doubt if he's aware of it. I'm sure nobody will have consulted him about the situation, and I'm sure his mind will be consumed by the prospect of starting employment tomorrow." She gazed at her husband for a moment, a twinkle in her bright blue eyes. "Mind you, I think we could be in for an interesting day. I'm looking forward to seeing exactly how Constance deals with the situation and how Daniel reacts." "Let's have a look at this, son." Daniel made a move to straighten his lad's tie. "Stop mithering thyself, either. Aunt Rose will no worry if me collar's no quite right." Daniel Senior chuckled. "I just want you to look your best, lad." He led the way up the short flight of steps to the Hedgerow's front door and rapped on the Lion's Head knocker. Within moments they heard the sound of feet on the entrance hall floor. The door opened and Grace the maid smiled a welcome. "Happy birthday, Daniel. Many happy returns. Good morning, Mr. Ackroyd. Come in, come in. Miss Rose is in the library." She ushered them along the passage, knocked briefly on the first door on the left, and opened it. "Mr. Ackroyd and Daniel," she announced, standing back to allow them to enter the library. Michael O'Donnell stood with his back to the fire, nodding his head and smiling a greeting. Constance stood at her station by the window, although she now had her back to it, the object of her questing eyes having arrived in the room. Irene Rose sat in her favourite armchair, to one side of the black marble fireplace. She stood up, balancing her embroidery on the arm of the chair as she did so. "Happy birthday, Daniel," she greeted the lad. Daniel smiled and walked over to her as his father joined Michael. He placed his hands on her shoulders and kissed her on the cheek affectionately. "Thank you, Aunt Rose. Are you well?" "Yes, of course." She grinned at him. "My, you look handsome in your new jacket. Just let me—" He laughed as she straightened his tie. "There," she said. "Just perfect. Don't you think, Constance?" "You look very nice, Daniel," Constance said quietly, suddenly seeming shy, an unusual situation, the young lass normally being the life and soul of the party. "Aren't you going to give Daniel his card?" Irene Rose asked, a mock frown creasing her forehead. The youngster smiled a smile that illuminated her pretty face, as if the sun had appeared from behind a cloud. She brought her right hand from behind her back to reveal an envelope. "Happy birthday," she said quietly, as she walked across the room, her hand held out towards him. He returned her smile and accepted the card. "Thank you, Constance." She gazed into his dark brown eyes as he took the envelope from her hand, wondering how he'd react to the carefully worded message she'd inscribed on the card she'd taken such trouble to make for him. They'd been friends and playfellows from the day she'd first come to live in the Hedgerow household 9 years previously. Daniel was 21 months older, but it had never seemed significant. They seemed to have grown up together, and as far as Constance had been concerned, Daniel was just a boy who was amusing and good company. Slowly over the past year, fondness had changed to admiration, and then to something approaching love. Daniel was no longer just a friend in Constance's eyes. He was an object of desire, who, despite her pretence and her earlier dismissal of him as being common, she dearly wished to have paid more attention, instead of always taking her for granted in a brotherly way, as he seemed to do, and as he was doing now. Daniel returned her gaze for a moment and smiled. "I'll open it later, Connie," he said, placing it in his pocket. He turned his attention back to Irene Rose without so much as giving the girl a friendly peck on the cheek, failing to see the shadow of disappointment crossing briefly over his young friend's face. Poor Constance was understandably upset at his apparent indifference. "Where are Bess, Faith and Benji?" he asked. "Matthew's taken them out in a pony and trap," Michael responded. "We'll be meeting them at Mary's kitchen later." "I need to be getting ready," Irene Rose said. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. "We mustn't be too late at Mary's. Why don't you two youngsters go out into the garden? Don't waste the sunshine." She turned to Daniel's father. "Would you like some tea, Daniel? I'll ask Grace to bring some." She smiled to herself as Constance seized her opportunity, taking young Daniel by the arm and gently guiding him out of the room before he had chance to realize what was happening. "That's more like it," Irene Rose thought to herself. "A woman has to be assertive to get anywhere in this male-orientated world, Constance, my love." Matthew Etherose sat on the bank of the River Medlock in Daisy Nook, feeling as happy as a sandboy and a lot younger than his actual age. It had been many months since he'd visited this rural spot, which had somehow managed to escape the ravages of the Industrial Revolution. His grandchildren, by adoption in the case of Faith and Benjamin, and by birth in the case of the youngest, Bess, now 8 years of age, were all off exploring, although not too far away to escape his attention. Occasionally, one or the other, and sometimes all three at once, would draw to his notice some small insect, aquatic animal, or unusual plant they'd discovered. His mind kept wandering back to the past, when he wasn't so much older than his grandchildren were now, and his father had brought him to this very spot. In those days, it comprised a tiny part of the rural landscape that predominated in this part of Lancashire before the exponential growth of the cotton industry and the equally accelerating expansion of the urban environment it brought about, attracting ever more labour to meet its voracious appetite. Daisy Nook now found itself surrounded by the textile townships of Clayton, Failsworth, Oldham, Athershaw, Waterloo, Ashton-under-Lyne and Droylsden, which were but small villages at most when Matthew was a child. Because of its geological peculiarities, as a small, steep-sided, twisted valley through which the Medlock meandered like a liquid serpent, situated on the edge of the Pennines on the one hand and as part of the Lancashire Plain on the other, it had managed to escape being built on to any large extent, builders always looking for an easy option and preferring level ground. The Nook boasted a tiny hamlet, a couple of farmhouses and a public house. As such, it was a magnet for young lovers, family parties and individuals of all classes who merely wanted to snatch a few hours' escape from urban squalor into a cleaner, simpler and more attractive environment. Wage slave and master alike could linger here by the river, delight in the scent of hawthorn blossom in spring, and be uplifted by the sight of yellow catkins on the pussy willows dancing in the breeze. Here they could picnic amongst daisies, buttercups and clover in the fields on warm summer days, dawdle along the river bank and collect blackberries, sloes and wild strawberries from the hedgerows in their seasons. Sometimes, by accident, men and women, boys and girls, from the two great classes in society, not only met, but found themselves communicating together, each feeling equal to the other as they jointly communed with nature. Some instinctively realized they were not merely just a part of the natural world, but actually belonged to the same animal species, and perhaps shared common attributes. A peculiar thing, since in their everyday lives they had so little in common, they might as well have populated completely different planets. On this particular day, Matthew Etherow, mill owner and man of means, had determined to enjoy the simpler pleasures of life and reminisce about days gone by, as a man of his age had every right to do. Daisy Newton not only held out memories dating back to his early childhood. This was the place, decades before, where he'd first met and subsequently courted the girl who was to become his wife and the mother of his beloved daughter, Irene Rose. If times were tense, and he'd been silly enough to allow himself to have a fallout with his spouse, this is where he'd always brought her, as a prelude to apologising and making up. In short, for Matthew it was a special place, a magical healing place, a place to remember his long-dead lover, but also to enjoy the young family he now found himself blessed with, to contemplate and weigh up the past, and to attempt to look forward to and plan for the future, whatever it might hold. Suddenly, a small, soft, warm pair of arms snaked around his neck, and a distinctive voice whispered in his ear, "Shouldn't us be getting back, grandfeyther? I don't wish to mither you, but Daniel'll be expecting us surely." Young Bess, Irene Rose's natural daughter, another admirer of young Daniel Ackroyd, and the one member of the O'Donnell family studying Broad Lancashire as a second language, rudely interrupted Matthew's thoughts, bringing him back to reality. "Happy birthday, Daniel. I wasn't certain you'd be here." Emma Chadwick looked at the lad who had been her closest companion and friend, and often her staunchest defender at Mary Upton's nursery, from ever since she could remember, a mischievous smile lighting up her face. Daniel laughed. "Well, as you can see, Emma, I'm here, and all the better for seeing you." "Well, Daniel Ackroyd," she responded with a grin, "I haven't a present with me, and I haven't made thee a card, 'cause I weren't expecting you, so I guess you'll just have to make do with this." With that, she put her hands either side of his face, pulled him towards her gently by the ears, and kissed him, full on the lips, completely devoid of any trace of shame or embarrassment, much to Irene Rose's amusement, young Bess's and little Faith's delight, and Daniel Senior's surprise. Constance, on the other hand, perhaps because she was more sensitive to the current mores and sensitivities of Victorian society, or simply because she was in love, viewed the whole episode with dismay. Daniel blushed slightly and then laughed, giving Emma a hug, before breaking away to look into her clear grey eyes, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "That's a good enough present for 1 year, Emma Chadwick," he responded, "though I don't know what your mother would say if she saw you kissing me like that, you wild goose." He gazed into her eyes for a brief moment, somewhat shyly, before making his mind up and kissing her on the lips affectionately in his turn. If a kiss was his birthday present, he might as well make the most of it. One of Daniel's very first memories involved Emma kissing him on a glorious summer's day, as summer days always seem to be when one was young. They'd been playing together, running about, chasing each other in Mary Upton's yard, when little more than toddlers. Daniel had tripped and fallen. As a result, he'd grazed his right knee on the stone cobbles. The incident had upset Emma, who thought it her fault, but Daniel had assured her she wasn't to blame. They'd sat on a curb together, and, sensing she needed reassurance, he'd put his arm around her as young friends do. Emma responded by kissing him softly on the cheek. Since then, the bond between them had strengthened. The two children had enjoyed many adventures together. They'd explored the banks of the Rochdale Canal, sneaking off when they perhaps shouldn't have, causing all kinds of worry to the adults in whose charge they'd been committed. They delighted in playing tricks on others, both children and adults, and were generally known as a source of mischief and good-natured fun. They'd explored their immediate part of the world together, and during the process had developed a profound respect for and confidence in each other. Over the years they'd become virtually inseparable. They'd soon grown to love each other, as they still did. However, it must be stressed this was the deep, rather profound kind of love enjoyed by two close friends who happened to be members of the opposite sex. It wasn't your common or garden lustful kind of sexual love, but an unspoken commitment of friendship and loyalty, the kind of trusting love that would last a lifetime. Nonetheless, little Faith wasn't to know the difference. She tugged on Constance's sleeve to draw big sister's attention to what she saw as a romantic drama unfolding before her eyes. Constance didn't welcome having the situation drawn to her attention. Having witnessed it with her own eyes, she was not amused. "Why does he have to speak and behave in such a common way?" she responded sharply. "He knows how to speak properly. He doesn't talk like that to Mother." Bess laughed. She might have been the youngest of the O'Donnell family, but she recognised the sin of envy when she heard it. "Maybe if you learnt Lancashire, Daniel'd take more notice of you, and you'd stop being mithered by th' idea of him being with t'other lass," she pointed out, exaggerating her own grasp of the local dialect, and demonstrating her knowledge of Constance's emotions and feelings towards Daniel deliberately, knowing it would annoy. Much to Irene Rose's amusement, Constance rose to the bait and rounded on her. "You're just as bad, Bess. You should know better, having been brought up in a decent household." Her youngest sister retaliated with another laugh. "Broad Lancashire's the language of the poets," Bess asserted. She grinned, delighting in her sister's discomfort, although it remained a mystery where she dreamt up that particular idea. Nobody asked, all instinctively knowing young Bess would be in no hurry to provide enlightenment as to the source of her knowledge. Irene Rose didn't know where her daughter had picked the idea up from either, but she did approve of her general advice. "I think Bess has a good point, Constance," she intervened. "Communication is very important, and I think you will find the language spoken by ordinary people is far richer in both the subtlety and variety of its words than so-called standard English." Young Daniel, being oblivious to this discussion and unaware that Constance was watching his every move, linked his friend's arm. "Find us a table, Em. I need to talk to thee for a minute. I'm needing advice, and thee art the one to provide it." Emma nodded and went to do as bid.